Question is in the name of the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Prime Minister, will the results of the state-owned assets referendum in any way influence his government's policy to sell state assets, and if so, how?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, no.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Why is he so arrogantly continuing the fire sale of state assets when Treasury advice is that it will barely break even and that he has already wasted $1 billion of taxpayers' money by rushing it?
Well, Mr Speaker,
Prime Minister.
I utterly reject the view that the government's wasted any money. In fact, government sold the share of the company so far into what's been actually quite a strong market, and the fact that actually the shares are trading either approximately, roughly or below actually where they're at in the marketplace shows you actually that the taxpayers maximise value.
Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable
To the Prime Minister. Why is the Prime Minister so arrogantly continuing his asset sales when the sales to date have transferred ownership of those assets from 100% of New Zealanders to just 2%? And doesn't this show that Kiwi mums and dads, not far from being at the front of the queue, aren't near the queue at all?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, firstly, the member's wrong. 51% of the companies are owned by all New Zealanders. Secondly, my understanding is the super fund ACC and other major funds are shareholders of those companies, and they hold those shares on behalf of all New Zealanders. There's a huge number of Kiwi Saver accounts. A member may remember those set up under a Labor government. They're owned by a wide range of New Zealanders. But Mr Speaker, here's an interesting one. There's been a number of referendums in recent times. One of them, for instance, was in relation to smacking. That was supported by 87.4% of New Zealanders. That was a policy pushed under a Labor government and, quote unquote, they arrogantly rejected it.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Order. 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 This is a point of order. It will be heard in silence.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. I'd submit that the Prime Minister didn't adequately address the question. The question was framed in terms of the number of New Zealanders who held shares in the assets, which advice shows has reduced from 100% to 2% on average between Mighty River Power.
Order.
Now that is different, sir. If I may finish, Mr Speaker. If I may finish. That is different, sir, from what the Prime Minister referred to, which is the total share of the assets owned by institutions which may include some New Zealanders, rather than the number of individual mum and dad.
Quite a sufficient point of order. The Honourable Jerry Brown.
Mr Speaker, well, first I reject any idea that that was a point of order. And second, of course, Mr Speaker, the question that was asked the Prime Minister was prefaced in a way that may well typify the Leader of the Opposition, but hardly is a way in which to elicit a reasonable answer to a question.
I thank both members for their points of view, which were probably in both cases not strictly points of order, but in that case the question asked by the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, certainly doesn't need to be repeated, was quite political in its phrasing, and the Prime Minister had every right to respond to it the way he did. The member may have further supplementaries.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Prime Minister, why does he think 7 out of 10 New Zealanders are opposed to the sale of Genesis? Does he think it's because New Zealanders are losing money, or are they just resentful that shares are being snapped up by foreigners?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, for a start off, the question actually posed by Reed Research on behalf of TV3 was wrong. I mean, Genesis, of course, is not being sold. A share of Genesis is being sold, Mr Speaker. But maybe the way to...
Order.
Well, let me relive your past so you can enjoy it, because we're certainly going to enjoy it on this side. Because, Mr Speaker, let's put it another way. This isn't the first time, actually, New Zealanders have heard about the mixed ownership program. No, Mr Speaker, during the 2011 election campaign, Phil Goff described the election as a referendum on asset sales. Russell Norman described it as the ownership and use of state assets has become, quote, the defining issue of the election. The Mana Party said it was a vote for National is a vote for asset sales. Well, guess what, Mr Speaker? We campaigned on it the whole way through. We won with the largest result in National's history under MMP, the largest result of any political party in MMP, and Labor, they got the worst result in the history of their party.
Supplementary question.
Order. I think, is it a point of order?
No, it's a supplementary question.
A supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Did the Prime Minister see the United Party's television campaign at the last election, paid for by the taxpayer, who the leader was Mr Dunn?
Order.
You're the whip, so keep quiet, for goodness sake.
Order. Let's hear the question.
Righto. Did the Prime Minister see Mr Dunn and the United Party's television advertising on water and water rights at the last election, paid for by the taxpayer, and were they not a clear signal to the country that he was opposed to that privatisation program? So where is the Prime Minister's mandate?
Right Honourable Prime Minister, as far as this is ministerial responsibility.
Mr Speaker, no, but I did see the New Zealand Herald today, which was running yet again a picture of Winston Peters holding up a sign saying no.
Order. Supplementary question, Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker.
Order.
To the Prime Minister, given that more people in the last election voted for parties opposed to the asset sales program than for them, and given that over 327,000 New Zealanders have signed the anti-asset sales petition, does he agree that there is unease amongst New Zealanders about his asset sales program?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I know the member spent a lot of the last campaign, the 2011 campaign, undermining the then leader. I mean, I think that's the reason why the Labor caucus don't like him.
The Prime Minister should answer. The question was political. The Prime Minister can answer the question.
Mr Speaker, I was answering the question. It was very germane to the answer.
Keep it within standing orders.
So, Mr Speaker, therefore, let me put it another way then. The member, while he was going about whatever he was doing, while Phil Goff was getting lined up because the then finance spokesman wasn't doing his work, may have missed the commercials run by the Labor Party.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order.
Given that you've already once recommended to the Prime Minister that he might actually address the question rather than whatever his personal fears might be on the day, Mr Speaker, I'd ask the opportunity to repeat the question, sir.
Order. Order. On this occasion, I'm going to allow the member to repeat the question, but if he makes the question as political as he did on the first attempt, he can expect a reasonably political response. Honourable David Cunliffe to repeat the question.
Mr Speaker, to the Prime Minister, given that more New Zealanders at the last election voted for parties that were opposed to the government's asset sales program, and given that over 327,000 New Zealanders signed the anti-asset sales petition, does he agree that there is unease amongst New Zealanders over his policy?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the election campaign in 2011 was dominated by this issue of mixed ownership model. National won that election with a comprehensive majority by any terms. Mr Speaker, this election, this Parliament has faced on numerous occasions, Mr Speaker, referendums about for which there has been significant public opposition. And we don't even know, by the way, Mr Speaker, what the results of this referendum will be. But the most recent one was when 87.4% of New Zealanders opposed smacking. Mr Speaker, that was a policy pushed by Helen Clark, the Greens and a Labor government. And all that we can say is that the Labor Party arrogantly ignored it. So when they're in government, they just ignore things, and when they're in opposition, they roar like little tigers or lions or what it is over there that they ever do.
Mr. Speaker.
Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable David
Mr. Speaker, given that the Prime Minister's wafer-thin majority looks like it's going to be hanging from the coattails of crazy Colin Craig, who believes in binding referendums, does he propose to ignore the results of the next referendum, just like he's ignored and arrogantly refused all the others?
Again, insofar as there is Prime Minister responsibility, right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to accept I've got a narrow majority in the Parliament, relatively speaking. It's 64 votes. But that's way better than David Cunliffe, who doesn't even have a majority in his own caucus.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question. Order. Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Prime Minister looking forward to receiving his ballot papers in the mail next week so that he can voice his view, albeit the view of a small minority in favour of asset sales, in the referendum?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, firstly, the member is prejudging the outcome. But what I will be saying when I receive my ballot papers through the mailboxes, what a waste of $9 million of taxpayers' money that the Green Party could have seen spent on vulnerable kids or a million other good reasons in this Parliament. And secondly, I'll say to myself, man, it was amazing the way they tried to con the New Zealand public that they had signatures they didn't have. And I'll say to myself, it's just another stunt from the Greens which won't work.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does he agree that it's important that all New Zealanders, even those like himself who are part of the small minority that support asset sales, participate in our democracy under this legislation and exercise their right to vote in the referendum?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's up to people whether they wish to participate in an election stunt or electoral stunt. But I'll just say this to the member. This is what I want the member to do. When he's going on the radio and he's on TV and all the various things he does over the next 3 or 4 weeks, I want him to say this. I want him to say, I am voting against the asset sales referendum that's put up. Fair enough. I'll be voting no, whatever he'll be voting. And I want him to say to the New Zealand public, I deeply apologise for being so arrogant to ignoring you on smacking, because that's what that member did. He was part of the party that drove that. So when it was smacking, he said to the public, I know better. But when it comes to the mixed ownership...
Order. I apologise to interrupt the Prime Minister. Order. I have a point of order from the right honourable.
Mr. Speaker, there's no way that answer could possibly come within any Speaker's rulings or standing orders, because it didn't address the facts of the matter. But the facts were to do with the referendum, and it was rather difficult to follow, particularly since it is the very man himself that got his party to actually vote totally against the referendum itself and vote for smacking.
I've heard enough.
What sort of fraud is that?
I've heard enough from the member, and on this occasion I don't agree with him. It was a very political question that was asked. It got an answer that could be justified by the Prime Minister.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Seek your clarification on that ruling, sir, as to why the Prime Minister's response around the child discipline law was within his responsibility and relevant to the question. Was it, sir, the fact that he co-drafted the law and supported it?
Member will resume his seat. The reason I consider the answer was satisfactory is the member asked the question, talked about citizens initiate a referendum. The Prime Minister was referring to an earlier one.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
To the Prime Minister, what does he think is better value for money? The cost of running the anti-asset sales referendum, which is $9 million thereabouts, the $147 million that he spent on ticket clippers for the fire sale of state assets, or the $1 billion the Treasury says that he and Bill English have wasted by fire sale rushing this sale of energy companies when the market couldn't absorb the shares.
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, well, firstly, the member's just plain wrong, actually, as he was yesterday in question time, even though he doesn't actually want anyone to go and have a look at what he said, which is about the third or fourth time he's been wrong, but don't worry, we'll keep an eye on that. Mr. Speaker, the government has actually maximised the return that it got from these assets. It's actually sold them into a strong market. And, Mr. Speaker, if the member is so in favour of referendums and thinks they should be binding, then he'll adhere to the one that saw 81.5% of New Zealanders wanting the number of MPs to reduce to 99. He'll support the 87.4% of New Zealanders that didn't want the smacking legislation. The member, like the Green member, can't have it both ways. They can't say, I'll ignore the public on the ones I don't agree with them in, but I'll want to follow them on the ones I do.
Point of order, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
With respect, Mr. Speaker, I don't believe that the Prime Minister addressed the rights supplementary there. It sounds like he was addressing the one about Colin Craig. Mr. Speaker.
The member will resume his seat. If he wishes to raise points of order, I'm happy to entertain them, but when it's an attempt to say he's dissatisfied with the answer, the way to do that is not by points of order. The way to do that is to ask further supplementaries.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has the Prime Minister seen Treasury's budget policy statement, which showed that the operating balance of the government would be worse off by about $100 million every year going forward as a result of his asset sales program?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's based on a number of assumptions. What's also true is that the government won't have $5 billion worth of debt that would otherwise have. And I know that the Green Party do not care about racking up debts on New Zealanders, but most New Zealanders actually do. And if the member thinks the government owning assets that he believes can return above the cost of capital is such a great idea, he should just go out and buy every other asset in New Zealand and fund them off the government balance sheet. Oh, hold on. That's what he is proposing to do, actually. I apologise. I'm sorry.
Answer now is satisfactory. Question number 2, Paul Foster-Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.